The Rwandan genocide has always been a piece of history that has both bothered and fascinated me. Maybe it was because it was countrymen killing countrymen rather than soldiers killing civilians. Maybe it was the international community's blatant disregard, I don't know. And we all know about the tribunal and courts afterwards, but what happened immediately afterwards? What happened to the bodies of more than 800,000 people when it was all over? Please like and subscribe if you find this video informative. Now let's talk what happened to the bodies after the Rwandan genocide. Warning, this video contains themes and images for educational purposes that some viewers may find distressing. The genocide. Rwanda is a tiny country in the middle of Africa, and when you see it compared to the size of other countries, it will go a long way in explaining how an entire country could be taken over by armed groups within days. Rwanda's population is made up of 3 ethnic groups. Before the genocide, 85% were Hutu, 14% Tutsi, 1% Twa. The Hutu and Tutsi population had been fighting on and off for generations, and by 1994 it didn't help that the government had been led by the Hutu leaders for over 30 years, with government radio stoking the tensions. Then on April 6, 1994, the president's plane was shot down. And while who fired the missile is still disputed to this day, extremist leaders of Rwanda's Hutu majority snatched the assassination as an opportunity to launch a carefully planned campaign to wipe out the country's Tutsi population. Political and other high-profile leaders who might have been able to prevent the genocide were killed immediately. Violence then spread through the capital and into the rest of the country and continued for 3 months. It was fast and organised. Militant leaders had lists of Tutsi names and addresses, and they hunted them down one by one. Groups of Tutsis fled to places that in previous times of turmoil had provided safety: churches, schools, government buildings. Many of these refuges became sites of major massacres. Thousands and thousands of Tutsis and people suspected of being Tutsis were killed in their homes, in fields, and on the roadside. Militants set up roadblocks across the country to prevent escape. In cities, towns, and even the tiniest of villages, Hutus answered the calls of their local leaders to murder their Tutsi neighbours. Entire families were killed, often hacked to death with machetes by their neighbours who they'd previously had good relations with. Hundreds of thousands of Rwandan Hutus participated in the genocide. As many as 1 million people, mostly Tutsis and moderate Hutus who refused to participate or were caught hiding Tutsis, were slaughtered within 100 days. By the end, almost 1 million people, 10% of the population, was dead. 2 million people had fled to neighbouring countries, and millions more were displaced within Rwanda itself. The bodies, part 1. Now, as you can imagine, the entire country had completely fallen apart on every level. People were either dead, had fled the country, or were so traumatised or injured that even trying to think of a way to clean up was out of the question. After the capital of Kigali was retaken on the 4th of July and the killings stopped, people did slowly start coming back, but most wouldn't return for months. Those Tutsis who returned described the country as silent, with no one around except for the rotting dead. It was these people, along with the survivors of the massacre who had stayed, who initially gathered together the bodies from across the city for burial. Often large brick-lined pits were created in the soil, sometimes with the assistance of the Red Cross, and the bodies were rapidly interred, recovered from houses, the hillside, roadsides, abandoned properties and shallow graves all over the district. Thousands of bodies were put into each pit, and there were thousands of pits, many of which are still being discovered today at an alarming rate. So why were Tutsi survivors the ones to do this? Aside from the fact that many Hutus had already fled the country out of fear of retaliation, many Tutsis were scouring the cities and towns looking for the bodies of their loved ones, and they collected the other bodies knowing that there might not be any family members left to find their loved ones. And the government was of no help. They had just been run out of office, and there was no functioning police force, ambulance, morgue, funeral workers. They had either been part of the murders or had fled or were dead. What healthcare workers were left, alongside with aid organisations, were overrun with the injured. Remember, the majority of people weren't killed efficiently with a gunshot. Most were killed by being slashed apart with machetes, so the injuries of those who survived were immense. So it was up to the survivors and returnees to bury the bodies. Bodies that were often months old, having been left out in the open. So this wasn't just picking up bodies and putting them in the back of a truck. This was scooping up thousands upon thousands of bodies who were severely decomposed and falling apart in the hot weather. As you can imagine, it was a health and sanitation nightmare. Many of the Tutsis who collected the bodies remember being in a daze. "We did the job that had to be done," one man said. "All my family was dead. What else was I going to do?" Now, I know there will be some misguided people who will cry that it was disrespectful to put thousands of people into a mass grave. It's so undignified. To which I say, shut up, child, sit down. Firstly, putting bodies in mass graves is standard governmental and organisational procedure after mass death events. But also, what did you expect them to do exactly? Identify everyone? Can't. Hands are missing, heads are missing, they've been chopped off. Funeral workers and specialist medical staffs are either dead or trying to keep the living alive. They should have been buried individually, it's more dignified. So you want to tell these people who had just seen their friends and families hacked to death that they could have done better? That they should have ignored the health risks and sat down and had a land management meeting about how to individually bury thousands of people whose bodies don't even look like bodies anymore. They should have had funerals for those that can be identified, to be mourned by which family members. Because if someone did survive, they were usually the only one. After large-scale mass deaths, looking after the living takes priority. These people did what they had to do. And did they have help? Not really. The majority of aid workers were sent to refugee camps just outside Rwanda's borders in neighbouring countries. Some countries, including Australia, UK, Canada and Zambia, sent small numbers of military personnel, but they were used to fix infrastructure, maintain security, help with medical work. Undoubtedly work that was needed, yes, but their governments were very firm about what they could or could not do. Survivors recall very little help from outside militaries and organisations in help clearing away the bodies. So yes, the Tutsi community buried their dead in mass graves and tried to get on with their lives. But these mass graves were always remembered. Then in 1999, the city of Kilgallee provided land for a place of remembrance to be constructed. And in 2004, the Kilgallee Genocide Memorial, the largest memorial of many around the country, was opened. But even 3 years before it opened, the first of 250,000 bodies were interred on the land as their final resting place, having been removed from the mass graves that they were quickly buried in years before. But these were the ones that were known about. There were others, a lot of others. The bodies, part 2. There are also stories, backed up by the graves that have recently been found, that many mass graves were made by Hutu leaders who wanted to get rid of the evidence in their areas. During the 100 days of genocide and in the following months before many returned, those they had murdered were thrown into the river, wells and pits around the country. These mass grave pits, over 1,000 of them, were uncovered regularly after the genocide, year after year. Most recently in 2008, 4 mass graves were discovered in one area containing 85,000 bodies. In 2020, another one was discovered containing 30,000 bodies. They are discovered after heavy rain, by accident, during building construction. Sometimes one pit is being dug up and those nearby who originally participated in the killings get nervous. This is how the most recent pit was discovered. Someone dobbed in their neighbour who lived near one of the mass graves that was being recovered for suspicious activity. Turns out the neighbour was pouring acid and trying to pulverise the bones of the victims that he knew were on the property, before the search party inevitably came knocking on his door wanting to search the area. You might say, why would they bother? One murder you might be able to cover up, thousands not so much. And everyone knew what was happening. But there was still fear of retaliation, whether it be by a new government or the international community, and they were held accountable. But the more basic answer is that they had, in their mind, achieved their aim, to get rid of the Tutsi population. Now they just needed to get on with their lives, and you can't do that if bodies are messing up the streets. So they threw them in holes, just like they would with trash, covered up the evidence and moved on with their lives. Rwanda today. Where Rwanda's Tutsi population was 14% before the genocide, today it is 10%, and there is a big age discrepancy in the population. Thousands have been found guilty of participating in the genocide and are in jail. The country, on the surface at least, has healed, and the government has pulled itself together, and many now refer to Rwanda as the Singapore of Africa. But warring parties still continue to fight in neighbouring countries. Survivors of the genocide still deal with the physical and psychological injuries, and victims of the genocide are still being found. On top of that, you can imagine the psychological impact the discovery of each new mass grave have on the citizens as they happen again and again for almost 30 years. The original estimate of victims was around 800,000, but as more pits continue to be uncovered containing such high number of victims, the original figure was overrun many years ago, and now the number is well into the millions, and we will never know the final number. The Rwandan genocide was largely carried out by everyday people with machetes and garden tools. The international communities did nothing to stop it, and they did the bare minimum afterwards. Mass graves continue to be found every year, and it's been more than 30 years. Survivors at the time did all they could do to clear the areas for the living. Undoubtedly, a body buried in a mass grave by family and community is better than a body not buried at all and left to rot on the roadside.